Hi guys, it's Andy McDonald, physio and strength and conditioning coach, and welcome to the Informed Performance podcast. On today's show, we have Nick Kane, the head physio at Essendon Football Club in the AFL. Nick is also the founder and managing director of the Sports Map network and the owner of Complete Balance Physiotherapy. Me and Nick connected recently as fellow podcasters, and we decided it would be a great idea to invite Nick on Informed Performance to discuss some of the physical demands and strategies that he deploys in the AFL, and in particular when he manages hamstring injuries. Nick really lifts the lid on his rehab strategy at Essendon, so you're in for an insightful episode. This episode of the Informed Performance podcast has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of the Force Frame. Used by health and performance professionals for assessing and improving performance and rehabilitation, the Force Frame is a powerful solution for quickly and accurately testing isometric strength and imbalances. In addition to testing athletes, the Force Frame is also used to maintain and improve strength, offering over 130 isometric training protocols. As a portable and easy-to-use system, the Force Frame is designed to ensure every measurement can be accurately and reliably measured, time after time again. To learn more about the Force Frame, visit our sponsor, volperformance.com. Informed Performance is a proud partner of HUMAC Norm by CSMI. By using the HUMAC Norm isokinetic system, you can see what you are treating. An isokinetic test measures maximum muscle capacity through range of motion. So when you're comparing an athlete's involved side's results to their uninvolved, this system makes it easy but objective to see where strength deficits exist to help you design a very efficient path to function. Then follow-up testing on the machine will confirm if your athlete or athletes are on the right path or if changes still need to be made. To learn more about the new HUMAC Norm and their refurbished machines, visit humacnorm.com. You're listening to the Informed Performance podcast with me, Andy McDonald, and here is today's episode with Nick Kane. Nick, welcome to the show, mate. It's great to get you on.
Andy, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure listening to your podcast over the last couple of years, mate. I really enjoyed a lot of the content, so good to be able to jump on board and have a chat to you.
Yeah, likewise, and I'll very early on admit that when we kind of started our podcast, I used yours a lot as a framework for how to interview clinicians and kind of create clinical-based conversations and podcasts. So, a lot of copycatting was done from me to you, so I thank you for that.
Oh wow, that's right. I'll take that as a compliment. I certainly found early on doing the podcast very, very messy, like my ones, and even still, like you finish your podcast, you're like, oh god, what sort of line of questioning was that, or didn't word that very well. It's just one of those things you just slowly feel you get a lot better at over time, but it's amazing. Then you look at some guys who do interviewing for like a career, like the Dentons and the different people on sort of on TV, and geez, they do a good job just to keep the question line on track. It's certainly a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, just mention Sports Map, and we'll kind of we'll get into that more as the conversation goes on. But can you just go through your background and kind of tell everyone who you are if they haven't come across you just yet, and bring us up to speed?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a sports physio. I live in Melbourne. My full-time job now is the head physio at the Essendon Football Club, which is in the Australian Football League, which is the professional football competition here, and might touch on that a little bit more around that sport for those who don't know too much about it in the UK and US. But I mean, we get 100,000 people at some games throughout the year, especially finals. It's a super popular sport here. There's 18 teams. So I've been involved in that competition now for almost 10 years, and started off as a rehab physio, rehab coach for the first few years, and then moved into more of a 2IC physio role, and I've been in the current role I'm in now for it's my fourth season, I think. So that's obviously the predominantly my week, and that's a full-time role. So, but within that, I've been lucky to start a physio clinic 9 or so years ago, and that's built into what's Complete Balance Physio now. So we've got a couple of clinics and 10 staff or 10 physio staff who are all awesome. So sort of staying on track with some of those clinical things outside of the sports setting, and it's really great to work with those guys and still do a little bit at the clinic here and there, as well as just collaborate with the great team we have there. And then obviously, yeah, you mentioned Sports Map a bit, so I balance those two things across with SportsMap, which is I guess not too dissimilar to you guys in the sense of like an education provider. We're sort of really focusing on the sports rehab and injury prevention, injury management space for clinicians, a little bit more, I guess, more experienced clinicians with a really keen interest in sport. And that started 10 years ago with some courses and conferences that I sort of started simply because I was a bit fed up with the courses I was attending as a physio. I wanted some stuff that was a little bit more in depth, a little bit more practical, and a great opportunity to network with different people. So I just felt like I wasn't getting that from the courses that were offered at that time. So we started putting together the course that we thought people would want, or I wanted at the time, which was, delving deeper into like groin injuries or hamstring injuries and spending some real quality time on that through assessment, injury rehab, and actually passing through some rehab stages, doing those progressions, feeling what they're about, and then stepping through to obviously return to play. And that's where most of our courses have spent their time through that space over the years. And since then we've probably ran a number of conferences and courses to have people from overseas come to Australia to do that, likes of Ed King, Jordan Menagucha, and have many other people sort of involved in that space from Australia. And and more recently just moved into what we call our masterclass platform, which is online learning, I guess. And that started from, well, you mentioned the podcast. It sort of started a lot from, if I'm listening to your podcast or a Pacey podcast, or I always found that I'd be really keen and listening in, but I sometimes couldn't visualize what they were talking about. I'm like, what is that exercise he's actually referring to? Or how is he actually doing that assessment? And that's probably where the idea started, would be like, how good a podcast to learn, but how good would it be to actually have that, but in a visual context where I can see what they're actually doing, look at the exercise, look at how, they're looking at the athlete. And that's where that sort of was born out of. And essentially now it is essentially that. It's a practical an informal approach to different injury management concepts and things across a range of topics, from this frank to syndesmosis to hamstrings to groins to hips, and some of the best clinicians on there. So people can always swing across the website and have a look at that anytime.
Cool. I mean, everyone's busy, but you sound incredibly busy with those three big buckets to occupy you. I don't know how you do all three of those.
Yeah, I was mentioned that to you last week. I get asked that a little bit at times, and it certainly comes down to having a tremendous support team. Obviously, my wife Jess does a tremendous job. We have a beautiful 14-month-old daughter now, so that's kept us very busy in the recent times. But also, an awesome team at the physio clinic and at SportsMap as well. So the guys who work there do all the grunt work these days, which is phenomenal. And I'm lucky to be able to just, when I'm at Essendon, to be really present there and try to be the best physio I can and knuckle down and try to do a really sound job there and keep working towards what we want there, which is obviously, I want to be sort of the very best medical and high performance team we can within the competition and wider space. So every year you're sort of picking things up to try and be better and find things to improve the program and what we're doing. So constantly on that that rabbit warren, that chase to be better in there, which is why sometimes some of this learning stuff across SportsMap and podcasts like yours and things like that are really important, because they allow us just to keep our minds open and keep thinking about what we can be doing better and where to improve.
You mentioned Essendon then. Can you talk through kind of the AFL, maybe some of the physical demands? I'm aware that maybe in the UK and Europe, but particularly in the States, there'll be a lot of people who aren't as familiar with what the AFL is. Can you kind of walk through what the game demands are?
Yeah, for sure. I was in the States just recently, actually, and part of the Prezzo, I just did a small little snippet of what the game is about a little bit, and rightly or wrongly at times I refer to it as a little bit of a cross between soccer and rugby, and that would upset a few people. But I guess the concept of what I'm trying to get there is that there's contact, there's tackling, and there's the 360-degree nature within soccer, which involves kicking and things like that. So if you sort of pull that together, it's a game that's played on a big wide oval. It's happening all around you. It's not like a linear place game like rugby. There's 18 athletes against each other at one point in time with a few interchange. The game goes for around 2 hours. I guess as a general numbers of things, like around 12 to 16 kilometres of volume per game, and that sort of ranges. Some guys will be above that, some below, but as an average. And I guess within that, we talk a lot about high-speed running and determine, I guess, where we phrase high-speed running starting, but let's just say it's at 25 kilometres an hour or something around that mark, anywhere from sort of 300 to 1,000 plus metres per game of that sort of high threshold running within that. And that might spread across anywhere from, 20 to 60 efforts above that speed. And then further to that, I guess, for the high-speed running demands, you might be talking around, metres above 85% of their max. So anywhere from, 10 for probably some bigger guys out to sort of 80 or 100 metres for those guys who are a lot faster and probably expose above that speed threshold anywhere from 2 to 5, 6 times a game. So I guess the concept of what I'm getting across there is you're asking like for this high volume of running, all right, but within that there's a lot of high speed running in relative demands to some other sports across a sort of a longer time period, high efforts, high demands, a lot of accel decels, and clearly the contact and just that metabolic demands of that contact and bash crash style of nature plays a role. And I guess where that leads us is that I think we're sort of optimally placed to get injuries at times within this sport. And there's some really good surveillance data over, I think it's almost 25 years now from it's called the Orchard Report or John Orchard Injury Report, and that's made up of stats which has been taken from every team over the last 20, 25 years, which details the extent of most time loss injuries and the incidence of injuries every year. So it's a really valuable piece of information for all the teams that we get access to, and it's available to the wider public to, I guess, look at and to know what our sort of key areas of injuries and time loss are, that we can really hone our approach to where most of our prevention management strategies would apply. And without going into full detail of those injuries, I guess hamstrings will certainly play a huge role in our injury space. I think if you're doing well, you might get 3 to 4 hammies a year, and you don't really want too much more than 7. But I think the average sits around 6 to 7 injuries a year, hamstring injuries that is, and hopefully most of those are not on the severe end, and you're probably going okay. Calves have certainly increased in recent years, and the time loss injuries to calves is sort of something that's sort of crept up over the last 5 years. We've found. Clearly, knees is an ongoing thing, especially probably the ACL component. Ankles play up. Obviously, there's a high incidence of ankle injuries, and often they don't miss too much. But with the syndesmosis and a few other things, we see that probably play a role in most some time loss injuries, as well as groins and stress fractures, probably to name a few. So they're probably, you can get a sense there that it's a lower limb-based sport and injuries. We do get shoulder and contact-based injuries, but other than maybe a shoulder dislocation that results in surgery, it doesn't result in too much time loss. But we predominantly deal with a high number of lower limb injuries and niggles across the season.
You mentioned that calf injuries have perhaps been on the way up, or more incidents. Do you know what's causing that in the AFL?
No, I certainly don't. But I guess, there's many theories around, I guess, where that might be coming from, and whether that's just the changes in the demands of the game and how fast it is and the workload of it, and also some changes in rotations and different things that they put on recent seasons that limits the amount of rotations players can come on and off the ground, and just the surfaces and the length of the season and pre-season. It's a really hard one to put a finger on, I guess. It could also be the case that, one of those things that just didn't get a whole lot of attention within the space as well, and sort of caught us by surprise a bit. And then, slowly both the research and probably our knowledge of how to address these and maybe hopefully condition the calves to, get less of that injuries is certainly on the up. And a colleague of mine, or an ex-colleague of mine in Brady Green, has done a lot of sound research in that space, a PhD on calf injuries, which was really based off a lot of statistics from the AFL. So that's a really good reference point to start with some reading, as well as, I think some of guys like, I think you might have had Glasgow on your podcast at one point in time. I think some of the work they're doing around in Irish rugby around some of their calf profiling things is really sound and leading the way. So I guess, you could pull out any number of theories around why the calf is increasing. I guess from my end, it's up to us to try to now, especially at my club, to reduce that incidents and hopefully improve our rehab space so we're not getting as many.
Yeah. In the States, rehab's kind of divvied up between AT and physio. In Europe, it's predominantly physio. How does your kind of role as a physio work in the AFL? How's the department structured?
Yeah, that's a really good question because we had a visitor actually to our club recently. He was working in rugby in Japan, and he was amazed at how integrated our physio and S&C and high performance team was. And he says, obviously, he's worked in New Zealand rugby, and they've been similar, but certainly across different places within the world, we know that there's like a big separation between some of these fields. And I mean, for us, it's highly integrated, almost as if it's just purely one team that sort of flows on. I guess, where does physio sit within that? I guess I see physio as a really important part in both rehab, monitoring and profiling. So if we touch on each of those things to a component, I guess, first and foremost, just within a normal week and a weekly cycle, the physios would probably be the first touch point around what we do as like a weekly monitoring or a weekly screening process, which, falls in line with your standard groin squeeze and hamstring pull and some hopping tests to sort of just get a gauge on how they might have come out of that game and trying to pick up anything that might be new for us, as well as then maybe looking at some finer things, which without going into too much nuance around it, but I think it's still relevant and important to look through things like our hamstring flexibility and how they've responded with that and how it is week to week, their hip range of motion, how they may be progressing along with some of their hip strength markers. So we do a sort of quick fire check of some of these key things every week, as well as those first few tests we mentioned there, and that would provide obviously week to week data, and we'd be looking at changes in those data, and that's in reference to the hamstring pull and groin squeeze and hopping. And if that was something pops out to us, that all I'm really looking for there is something that's sort of against the norm. And yeah, we have obviously data plots that would designate as a flag, but ultimately I'm looking for a change, and that might be where they're typically pain free on something and all of a sudden they feel a little bit different, or their powers usually feels really good and they've dropped that power. And for me, that's just about the physio's role then to be like, all right, come over, let's have more of a detailed look, let's make an informed decision, and it's up to the physio to make a decision on the sound process of what we're doing there. So we would have a really clear process on, if it is a groin, what tests are the physio then going to look through, so it's consistent across like the 3 or 4 staff at physio, so we don't just get all lost down different pathways. And then, working from there really closely with the S&C team and the guys taking training. If there needs to be modifications made, we do that to optimise whether it's main skills or making sure they're ready for the game. So where that physio space is, I guess it's super important to have a really close knowledge of the intricate details of each player and what's normal for them and what's not normal, what's a significant change and what's not. You've got guys who will report a lot more and, that's probably okay, and you can listen to that. And then you need to know the guys who, often don't tell you too much and all of a sudden they're saying their foot's a bit sore. Like, that's enough to really have a sound, detailed look. So it's probably setting the week up. And then really important that physios are on top of things to just track that through the week. So if we've picked up that his hamstring was there, and we're going to implement some practices about how to optimize that, whether that's some treatment-based work or some exercise or some load modification. But then we obviously need to review that throughout the week and make sure that's getting back to the level we really need it before we're going to expose them to the higher demands of whether that's training or the game. Happy to chat through any of monitoring stuff in a little bit more detail. But I guess then that moving on to, where I sit on the profiling thing, and I think I use profiling as a term that, certainly in the performance and S&C space, we talk about the performance profiling. They might be doing some counter movement jump and mid-thigh pull and really look at things to optimize what targets they're going to do within their training and their gym space and on field. But I guess for where I like to really work in this space is really nailing down our profiling around some what I call isolated muscle groups or energy leaks in quotation marks, or something that could be deemed an energy leak. So if I'm really poor with hip abduction or really poor with an isolated calf strength, you'd think that's going to translate into an energy leak in a performance movement. So for us as a physio team, we would really take close attention to detail on profiling the guys across their hip charts. So that's hip extension, hip abduction, hip flexion, hip adduction, and occasionally with some hip internal and external rotation as well as our profiling stuff through our counter movement jump, seated calf isometric test, and they're probably the go-to ones at the moment, and making sure, I guess, putting that all together and putting it in place with what we think is a required level for our sport or for this athlete to target and to get towards. So we work closely with the SSE team in that. So if I profile someone and we find that their calf strength's down or their hamstring strength's not at the level or their hip strength needs some work, then we'd get that within the program, and that might be driven from the physio to do some individual sessions with them, or it might be sort of working with the SSE guy and saying, hey, let's get this as an exercise that he routinely does in the session. There's not rocket science to that, but I guess it's it's important to obviously test something, and if you're going to test it, how are you acting on it, and how is it going to be reassessed and to improve it? So I think that's where in the past, I reckon years ago, it'd be like, oh, we might test something. Yeah, he's not very good at this, and then 4 weeks later, it's you're none the wiser, and it just flows on. So for us, it's just about that routine follow-up, routine check, and making sure that that's progressing across the season. We do that like 3 time points at least across the season. I'll dispel there. You got any questions on that before maybe we touch on rehab?
No, that's all great, and appreciate appreciate you lifting the lid on what you do.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine. And then certainly from a rehab, which I think we're going to touch on some of that a little bit further in where the physio space. But for me, I think the physio plays like a really important role, but so does everyone within the athlete's rehab. I guess, without going into the full detail, because I think we'll touch on it with a hamstring example, but I think one, first and foremost, is when you get an injury, what role does the physio play in identifying those things that potentially are contributing to that injury? I think sometimes it's easier for a young athlete, if you get someone in, they just usually they just really lack capacity and lack the strength, and to pick up that stuff, it's pretty easy, and your rehab's pretty sound. It's sort of like, they don't have endurance, they don't have strength through their hamstrings or what have you, and that's clearly just got to get that to the level. But probably for the older athletes or the more experienced guys that have been around for a few years, the level of capacity is at the required space that you'd want it, but they still have managed to get injured. So what do you do then, and how do you work through that? And I think that's where, being creative and also exploring things a little bit more in depth with the team and with the athlete to, I guess, hypothesize why you think some of that might be happening, and then how do we address it and how do we get that better is probably one of the key challenges within rehab as a physio, and just working closely with your rehab coach or your SSE team in how you space that out every week. And I think I try to limit handovers in our rehab process. So that is whereby if I'm the physio and 5 days later I'm like, yep, see you later, you're with Tim, the rehab guy, and then the Tim will pass on to the high performance. I think it's largely for us, it's like if I'm the physio and the rehab coach, we'll just work with that athlete all the way through his hamstring rehab, and the rehab guy will be on field with him, take him through his speed progressions and his run progressions. Maybe I'll get some eyes on his hamstring loading in the gym, but otherwise the S&C or rehab guy will take him through all these exercises in the gym. And I think where I think that's important is because each day or the follow-up day, I'll reassess him and monitor the response to that. So if I'm seeing a change in hamstring length, or he's feeling a bit tight on one side, and that sort of thing, it's really important to, I guess, get a sense on where the athlete is at every day, how they're responding. If they're just eating that workload up, then we can sort of progress along a bit quicker. And if it looks like they're sort of struggling a little bit and pulling up a bit sore here and there, then obviously working with the coach and saying, well, let's modify a little bit here. We might need to just slow down for a few sessions and get our strength back up and reload from there.
Yeah. Feel free to pick any injury as the kind of anchor, but also feel free to carry on with the hamstring one if it's easiest. But can you walk me through maybe what are the aspects or considerations that you make when you're planning and setting up the rehab process? Perhaps the key steps and maybe what that involves for you. Yeah.
I'll definitely try to, and certainly, obviously, I think I've touched on this before. Like, obviously, rehab's such an extensive process, and to sort of get it all out and make it sort of come out in a nice, consistent flow and sound really easy is a difficult thing, because it's obviously a day-to-day process that you work through every day and make decisions based on that. But I think, as I alluded to, I think you've got some awesome podcasts out there from some terrific hamstring research and of the ones I've listened to over the recent episodes. And I guess I thought we'd sort of touch on hamstring a little bit and see if we can sort of pull some of the components of where I've picked different research bits up and how that might just fit within our hamstring management or rehab process without going to sort of the depths of research detail around that, but just where I've pulled a few things and try to tie it into how our process works. So if I step through that maybe in the early phases of a hamstring rehab, and you can stop me at any point and have a bit of a chat and clarify something I might be missing, that'd be awesome. As I sort of mentioned there, I think let's just say someone clearly has a hamstring injury or done a hamstring injury. The probably first and foremost key part within the whole concept, and almost one of the most important, is just that early communication and how that's worded both to the player and externally. So we have a really strict and sound process that it'd be like myself and the doctor that would work through the initial diagnostics and I guess prognosis based off early assessment and imaging. It's a funny, often conversation around like timeframes, but I think within the environment we're in, it is helpful to set some timeframes. So you get a concept of, okay, this is the injury, you need to respect healing times. We know we're off here. It's going to be roughly this amount of time. So let's just say it's a 4 to 5 week hamstring. And we always make sure we use the concept. It will depend on how your rehab goes. It could go quicker if you move through these stages really well, or it could go slower if we don't. So I guess trying to say we're respecting our imaging, but we're not solely just looking at imaging and making decisions based off that. We're going to really work through our clinical process and how you respond. And a lot of the research would say those first 7 days starts to give you a real indication of how that's going to progress along. So again, when we communicate things to coaches and the like on timeframes, then, it's always leave a little bit of room for error there, and always say that we're going to see how we go over the next few days and we'll keep them updated on the process. So that's probably the first part. And, it's really important to make sure the athlete hears that first from us, and it's not then him speaking to other staff and speculating around what that might be, or asking the rehab coach or asking another, staff member about what they might have heard or what they think. It's just really clear, concise. It's consistent message from, I guess, the key point people in that, which would be the doctor and physios, that they get a really concise and clear communication pathway and not getting too caught up in sort of the other bits. So that's probably one thing we're really strong on there. And then from that process, obviously I would look at, or the physio would do a detailed assessment on the player, so player per se. So that's probably more global to the injury. So and as well as the hamstring in this case. So without going into too much detail on the actual hamstring assessment at the moment, like we know that there's some really good research bits to suggest that the influence things like a lumbar pelvic control might play on hamstrings. And this probably applies to that player where I've talked around, they're a bit more experienced. We know they've got general decent hamstring capacity. We'll certainly assess that, but also we need to look at other things that may be tying in. So stepping aside from the hamstring, I'll be looking at some lumbar pelvic control, where they're at with that. So even just some basic tests like a double leg lowers, can they control their feet all the way to the ground without sort of dipping into anterior pelvic tilt? What is their hip extension strength like? So whether that's pre-injury or when the injury it's ready, we'll probably get an indication on where their hip extension strength is at. Early on, it's easy to look at sort of some foot and ankle stuff. I think around, in the high-speed running and not getting any collapse through the foot and ankle, so making sure they've got good foot and ankle stiffness. And so obviously assessing ankle range of motion, assessing their ankle strength and capacity is an important component. So, is there any inversion, eversion, strength down? Is there deficit in, first toe extension? And just maybe looking at those things in a little bit more depth. This is like day 1, day 2. So I'm just starting to get a bigger picture on things. Do they have good foot and ankle stiffness? If we haven't got a recent testing on that, we might look at that in the next couple of days. Are they playing with any other niggles at the moment? Is there some knee issues that might be, causing some guarding through the hamstrings that, maybe we can look to try to clean up with some hands-on work or just some really optimize their gym loading and things like that. Clearly looking at the hip extension and how both legs work to interact. So, early on we'd be making sure we're optimizing our hip extension range of motion through some rec fem length work or, psoas and some hands-on work through maybe the anterior muscle structures of TFL and psoas, as well as then, clearly it's nice and easy to have a look at hip abduction strength and things in that space, which I think will tie, a lot into some of our drills and some of our exercises through the mid-stance running phase. So I guess first up, that's probably the concept of where we're looking. We're trying to tie in around what other things might be contributing to this. Clearly, we're going to be looking at their recent loading history and what might have happened there. The preceding 8 weeks, was there changes in that? Did they have a previous injury? All those sort of things would come into play. But talking here probably more in, what I'm having a chat to with the player in the physio space. And clearly just start to get an idea on where the hamstring is at through your routine hammy tests, so length tests, max hip flexion, and some flexibility bits, which I'll chat through shortly. So, so basically stepping through that, we know we're going to start doing some hamstring loading soon, but what else is going to be unique within this program that's really targeted to this player to address what we think might have been causing it? So that's where then we'll sit down with the rehab coach and be like, all right, these are probably his 2 or 3 key things that we really need to nail down and hit, and we start that probably day one. So that might be some of that length work, some hip extension strength work, and some foot and ankle strength or stiffness bits that would sit separately to the hamstring work. So that sort of gets going straight away. Our rehab coach would set up the, our pathway or plan based on a rough prognosis or timeline. So, and that would sort of start to kick into gear almost day 1, day 2. Early on, we'll respect the healing, allow a little bit of recovery, but when they're ready, we'll start them, once they're walking pain-free and things like that, we'll just get them moving with some basic drills, some side-to-side drills and some basic linear mechanic drills that would step through in the next day or so. And I think that's an important part to, they talk about running mechanics and how that, can tie into both our injury prevention and within our management. Actually, Dean Benton did a good masterclass on that, and Jonas Dododo does obviously a fair bit of work through it, as well as Jordan and JB Marin. So I think, in the old days, or when I first, not old days, but first turned up to the club, Sherry and Best was a paper that was referred, and that was like one of the first hamstring papers around neuromuscular patterns and movement. And I think, it still holds true, but I think now we'd probably use some really sound coaching around good running mechanics and good patterns and positions within their drills. So, and we can start that really early. It's a nice one to build confidence for the athlete, nice one to be able to get them moving. And then it also obviously clearly ties on to maybe some stuff around their running mechanics in the later phases. So kicking that thing off nice and early, as well as then, as soon as we can, we're getting them running. And even though, we know the hamstrings work at high speeds, but I think we target to have the athlete running normal volumes of what the main group would, or what the athlete usually would in the first week. So might run at day 3 if it's a stock standard 4-week hamstring, and we try to get, if it's 20K plus for the week, whatever that player would be doing. So certainly volume running would be safe, whilst we're probably doing some sharper drilling work, addressing what we think is probably driving into that hamstring injury a little bit, and then gradually bringing in a little bit of the stuff around acceleration patterns and positions. Certainly going back to the injury mechanism, if it was more of an accel injury, it'd be probably a higher priority, but I still think, again, a lot of the research from JB Marin and how important that is to, drive through our initial first 3 steps of the acceleration pattern. So early on, we might just be doing some basic wall drills, and then once they're ready in the next few days, just moving into some upright sleds or upright prowler sort of pushing, and then gradually move into more horizontal positions and increasing the load on that over the first 1 to 2 weeks. And then I feel like, if that's in the factor and we're working through that process well, then it leads us nicely into when we want to actually excel a little bit more maximally on field and lead into our running speeds. And then, I guess for where I would be working in that, so or a physio in those early phases, we'd probably be doing it together with the rehab coach typically. So maybe the first few days, some run drills. In our space, the physio would be doing it because the rehab guy will be out on track with some other injured guys. But as soon as they're out running, they'll be out running with the fitness and rehab coach. And, we would be playing that real key role as their loading increases to, as I said, really monitor any changes on some of our key things. And for me, that is very much around probably flexibility, tells it like a nice tale of that. So flexibility being Neural flexibility. So if there's any restriction within that space, certainly like the hip extension range of motion and how important that is for a hamstring length, as well as your standard hamstring length test of an active knee or a max hip flexion active knee extension. So I'll measure that pretty much every day, especially in the morning of running days, and I'd measure that with a clinometer. So I think I value if it's 5 or 10 degrees out that you probably can't pick up with the eye, but if it is 5 or 10 degrees different, then that's just like something small to pick up, and probably wouldn't change what I'd do, but I'd note that, and I'd probably try and correct that with some manual therapy and things like that. But I think it's funny, I had a hamstring not too long ago, which was his second injury in 2 years. It was like a kicking related injury. So if it would kick from 50 metres and would sort of wind up and would get like a bit of a distal hamstring, it would have a low-grade distal hamstring strain with kicking, which is an unusual mechanism. Obviously, you take him through a slump test, and that would be quite restricted. And I was amazed to probably see in the last couple of years, over a short period of time, how much improvement we can get in that slump and neural mobility just from some routine work, some self-exercise things, and really then about maintaining that. And I think the margin for error for some of these guys is like so small that, they might just drop off on some exercises that they're bits, or they're at a bit of back pain and they're carrying a bit of neural restriction. It doesn't take much to sort of offset so I think if as a physio, if I can optimize 5 or 10 degrees within any of those hamstring length tests, and it's really going to reduce the strain on the hamstrings at the higher level. So certainly trying to nail that stuff early on is probably a really key part for me.
Something I wanted to kind of touch on a second ago, when you are doing that kind of early plyometric or early running work with the athletes, do you have certain loads or speeds that you cap them at certain stages in rehab, or are you kind of going off of, say, changes in flexibility, symptoms? What kind of, other than the stuff you mentioned on neural sensitivity and range, is there anything else that guides you through that process or limits you?
Yeah. Do you mean they're like the actual running drill stuff, or more in the running when we start to bring them up into some height, into some speeds?
More in the running where the speed's actually more of a factor than when you're drilling.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I guess it's probably the next phase where we go with this anyway. So I guess, certainly through the drilling stuff, you're just getting a bit of a feel on where they're at. You want to know that they're range and feeling comfortable with all those things, and it's probably just getting a sense on how they feel. But certainly before we're building them up, so that first week, let's say it is the volume-based running, which is not putting too much things at risk. But then from there, you're generally pretty comfortable to bring them up closer to sort of 80% speeds, but without too much duress happening there over the next phase. And you do that just through some graded 80s or 100s. And I guess your question there is what other things would I look at to sort of make sure that the athlete's in place before they're doing that? That certainly comes back to probably strength and our capacity within that measure. So I do just a graded isometric testing. So first of all, you do your routine hamstring contraction test, which is on a physio table, and get an idea. But I like to then get a number and do some isometric testing in different ranges. So probably more an outer range bias, and having pre-injury numbers on this, we get a sense on where they're actually at in relative to where they've been before. So I certainly want them like closer to 90% of in that isometric contraction of their pre-injury status, or at least to the, if you don't have that, to I guess to the other side, before we're starting to sort of creep them up into those sort of 80% zones. So, typically that isometric contraction's back anywhere from 7 to 10 days. And, up until then you might be running 80%, and then you're more comfortable to get to, hover around that 80% mark, which we know the hamstrings might start to kick into gear a fair bit more after that. So I like to at least have those strength measures in place first. I guess, do you need to do that? You probably don't need to all the time, but for me, it gives great confidence that, okay, I'm at least covering off on, the contraction here is sound, and that would also, I'd also be gathering information through that first 7 to 10 days on what they're doing in the gym, which I didn't touch on too much earlier, but through that phase, they're doing their normal patterns of movement within the gym. They're squatting, step up, doing all the normal bits, and as well as obviously commencing some hamstring loading. So that would be sort of some work over the hip, so single and double leg over the hip work, so RDL type motions, whether that's on a 45 degree or just doing it with the barbell, as well as obviously some targeted hamstring loading. So depending on the athlete, I might start with some timed under tension work in either some long isometrics, or it might be some just at least achieving an endurance measure for their single leg hamstring bench bridge, which should be at least 25 or 30 repetitions. And that's probably where, that older athlete or the more experienced guy will probably eat that up. But if you've got a 20-year-old who's never had an injury before, they're probably struggling to do that. So that you probably target that a little bit more for that guy. But for the experienced player, you're probably back doing some decent, eccentric loading, which might start with, some eccentric slides and loading that up to some eccentric slides, and that will then progress back into, I guess, a Nordic exercise, which, some people think Australians just love Nordics because a bit of the research has been done over here. It's certainly a part of the picture, but it's not the sole at all. The only thing that we would use, and I'd be fair to say across probably all the clubs within the AFL, I think it'd be routinely used, but not excessively. Maybe 2 sets of 3 or 4 reps once a week is probably the extent of where that would be at. And because there's devices that record strength on that, and there's reasonably reliable, and you often have pre-injury numbers on that, we use that as another measure for where we're at through our rehab process. So I guess after that, isometric testing is back to sort of pre-injury levels, and they've commenced a Nordic. We'd want to know that their Nordic numbers are what they were prior, or if it was a deficit, they're much better. So we'd probably work off anywhere from 4.5 to 5 times their body weight being a target for their Nordic, and at least within a symmetry of less than 10 degrees would be ideal in that space. Is just one other measure of hamstring strength. We obviously do a few, but that for me then would be, if you're doing that with a Nordic and we're starting to lift our capacity within our work over the hip and things in the gym are sort of back to our sound levels of what we want, then you're starting to know, okay, well, they've got the endurance, they've got the strength here. I might throw a bit of energy storage and release work at them within the gym prior to high-speed running, just as a level of exposure. Can they handle that and they feel comfortable with that? And then you're starting to build confidence within the athlete who's out there running 80%. He's ticking off your hamstring markers in the gym and demonstrating he's got the capacity. You're also addressing what you thought might have caused that injury, and now you're starting to, I guess, build that information to be able to say, all right, let's start to tip out to 85%, 90%, and sort of go from there. We'd probably want most guys at least running between 90 and 95%, clearly being able to do that and feel comfortable and fully trained before they were to play. I'm stepping forward here a little bit, but making sure that those numbers that we referenced back at the start, that their exposure is above 85%, their speed exposure is above that or threshold zone of that high speed running of what I refer to as anywhere from 300 to 1,000 metres for a game, and what is that across the whole week of a typical training and game week, and making sure that's at the level. And if it's not at the level before they play, then it's really important that we get them to that level, and that's then held as a real consistent approach every week, that they're achieving within the zones that we'd want to know that they're not going to drop out of the I guess for want of a better word, spike or underload on their high speed running or that sort of threshold based run, as well as and then moving forward and having that training approach, I think is really important to make sure they're just fully training with the team, and by that stage you just need to know that they're ready on that day, and you can sort of away they go, hopefully.
I think this gets spoken about probably less, at least in podcasts, but teams obviously do this. But how do you approach kind of monitoring post-injury when they are back to playing, or that stage when they're back playing, but you still want probably a decent amount of hamstring work and protective work in their program? Yeah,
good question. I think something I didn't sort of touch on there in that later phase of rehab, which we sort of would skim over a bit more. But where I've seen or where I've gone wrong in the past, and where I still think some people do, especially probably also more so with calves actually, but you're in that phase and we can get a bit too excited and try to do too much hamstring loading, and it's like we're trying to, it says we've got to do some stuff over the hip, we've got to do some fast catching bits, and then you got to do these Nordic things, and and all of a sudden they're doing heaps of hamstring work, and they're just overloading the hammies, and then on field they're either not going to feel as good, or God forbid something happens because you're just doing too much within the gym. And I think that comes back, leading into your question there, to as we, they have returned to play, what through your rehab process did you earmark as the biggest things that player needs? So is it their level of what exercise do you want out of it, what loading do you need it to get to. And if they're not there yet, that's fine. You can gradually work to that level. But I guess it's trying not to do too much. It's picking the pieces out of 2 or 3 key things. And I think post-return to play, it's a really delicate time period where I don't like to change too much. So probably the week or so leading into return to play, you'd sort of want their general gym program consistent and pretty sound, and of what it's going to look like thereafter for the following weeks, because I don't want to be adding new things in. The new load is going to be the game load, and then from there you're probably talking around getting back to a level of compliance or optimizing, all those tests we've talked about. So making sure all our flexibility tests are back, making sure our isometric pull is back and they're not having any palpation soreness post the game. So that's, first of all, they've responded and pulled up well. Getting a little bit of base loading in there, but not trying to then continue to kick things up a gear, and maybe just hold that balance for, I think it's probably a sensitive period for probably 3 to 4 weeks. And I think where I've probably missed the boat in the past a bit is, I think you might get a player through, they play, you review them after the game, they move through that week, and it's sort of like curtains, like that's it, they're done, back into play, and they sort of miss a bit. But yeah, it's super important that through that phase you are following up on all those key work-on areas that we talked about that we think might be playing a role, that they're still either addressing them or they're holding they're in a nice consistent level, if that's the neuromobility or hip flexibility or what have you, as well as their hamstring loading is like nicely consistent and they're able to get good load through that week to week, as well as they're running numbers in that, as I've touched on, are consistent. And I think Malone out of Ireland and the Gaelic work are doing some great stuff on speed exposures and week to week changes within how that might look. So I think that's a nice reference point to people to look at, and I think that's probably the biggest thing of balancing that over the 4 weeks. So I'll play my role in like looking at the athlete and how they're responding, but it's up to us as a team to make sure that those numbers are really consistent about what we want, so we're not getting any drops in both performance and sort of something that will create a spike in the next 1 or 2 weeks and maybe leave them a little bit vulnerable.
Now, you obviously have a podcast and with Sports Map, and of course you provide education as well. And I know recently you've been out to a team in the States doing some education. I just want to kind of hear your thoughts on continued development for physios and PTs, and what can or what should they do in the event that they get stuck with a difficult injury presentation.
Yeah, and I think it's good to see. Obviously, I love the work you guys do, and Rob Pacey in the UK, and hopefully, and like what we do. And I'd like to link in a little bit with you guys, like more moving forward. And I think because ultimately, that education space, it's driven from, well, for me, it's a personal drive for me to get better as a physio. So it's still, no matter what I'm doing, it's still largely trying to embed and improve like who I am as a physio and what I'm doing, and just chasing down that information. So the fact that I love how passionate you are about that space, and that's the same for me in the sense of just working to always, find those new bits of information that you think, as you get more experience, you don't know what you don't know, and you're constantly driven by that in the sense of you don't want to sort of get caught out and stuck too much by just not knowing something. You just want to be on top of things more and more, and there's always new information coming out and evolving. So I like to think that's where we sit, both from what you're doing in the podcast space and certainly our masterclass platform, to be able to make people better as physios and feel more confident and capable in what they're doing. And that's sort of, driven from some fantastic clinicians out there to sort of to pass that information across. But we were out in the States recently doing our courses over there, and hopefully we'll be out there a little bit more in future doing some bits. But I think, I guess for me, where I would go if I get stuck like with a case, my method is I just first probably go out in quite a wide space. So I'd start like doing my research around online and seeing what type of readings there are and papers there are. Going then into some podcast space and listening through on that if I'm getting stuck on a particular topic. So, and then from there, I would love to try to reach out and actually chat to people where I find this super beneficial. So, and it's probably more collating all that information. I think I can collate as much information as I want. And the issue with doing that when maybe as a more of a junior clinician is you just get totally lost in that information, and you find yourself trying to do a million things and getting completely lost. And the biggest probably takeaway is just being able to still have clear sort of processes and systems that you use and finding your own method. And I think that maybe comes with some experience where it's sort of like you have your method, but you can grab a little bit of this from Manag, or a little bit of this from Fergal Kieran or Ben McDonald, and you add that into your weight of things. But it's not like you're off trying to be different clinicians and try to grab everything. So I think first and foremost is probably developing your method in how you are as a physio and what works for you, and not trying to sort of be everyone else, and work within your strengths and what makes you good. And then clearly from there, when you get a little bit stuck within a topic, it's still like you've got your sound process and you get that in place with the athlete first. So for me, if I'm going to seek another opinion, I'm probably privileged in a position to work at Essendon, where if I want another opinion or I get a little bit stuck, I could just go to. It's amazing that I could pick up the phone and probably anyone. They're often willing to help you, from the likes of Edna King to Craig Purdom and Phil Glasgow, are often helpful, to give you a bit of a hand. But if you are in a clinic and that might not be the case. So I guess I like to just make sure I get all my ducks in a row how I think they should be, like right to the level. I'm like, clearly this still needs work, so I'm going to push this player because that's a key area to get that strength up, or fix that hip extension, or fix their running stuff, and where I think they're at the level. And then it might be like, now I need my 5 or 10%. Like, where do I go from here? Or I'm reaching a bit of a sticking point. Let's go somewhere else, and not sort of just be lost and just like, where am I? And just try to grab everything from everywhere to start with. So I don't know if that answers it too well, but I guess, my point is like build your system and build what works for you, and pull the information into that to sort of guide your further progression in the space of your learnings, to sort of tidy things up and just progress year on year from there.
Probably like yourself, I think like one of the benefits definitely that I've found with the podcast, at least, but I don't think people have to have a podcast to be able to reach out to these people, is your phone book grows and you build relationships with topic leaders. So great people, the best people you can reach out to and ask for help. But the thing I've noticed is that when I do that, I really want to get my house in order before I have that phone call, because there's nothing more embarrassing than if you pick up the phone to ask somebody for some help on a tricky case, and very early on in that phone call, you just haven't cleared something very simple. So I think like just the mentality shift of, okay, I'm going to pick up the phone and talk to this really good person about this topic. It kind of naturally makes you get your ducks in a row before you speak to them. And that may answer the questions before you actually get to them. But at least the level of detail or the problem solving they're going to do is going to become higher level when that happens.
Yeah. Oh, mate, spot on. And even to a greater degree when you're taking an athlete to see someone as well, which I do regularly, as I see it as a great learning tool. But you don't want to roll in there with your athlete that you've been working with, and then all of a sudden the other physio is just like, oh, what's going on here? Like, that is miles off. You really want to try to get it to that level, and then hopefully you can add some cream to that and just get some new learnings and some new direction from that. I think that's really important. But that's, I guess, and that's where, again, some of that not to try to, the masterclass platform stuff is actually where I've like been so lucky to be able to go and sit in with athletes or excellent clinicians, is why I've actually tried to create that, to pass that on to everyone. So, because I know if you're in a clinic, and it is harder to get access to those people, but tried to create that in the sense of how lucky I've been to get those learnings, because it's one of the best ways to learn. Like, you get your ego, you have to drop your ego, and your management stuff gets pulled apart a little bit and exposed, and you've just got to be able to be like, yep, okay, I could have done that better. From now on, I'll do this bit better. So it's a brilliant way to learn, and hopefully some of the work within the podcast stuff that you guys do and some of the videos and things that we have give people the opportunity to sort of get that same level of learning.
I feel like also when people are in that higher level, more applied learning environment, regardless of what stage they're at, if there is some, let's just call it academic gaps, just knowledge gaps, those settings are great for teasing those out anyway. And that you can still get through on those courses quite easily. And on the side or afterwards or in the evening or when you get back, read the papers that you need to kind of fill in the gaps of why that applied stuff may then make sense. So I think it's a great way to do it.
Yeah, spot on.
Nick, where's the? I'm aware of time, and I know you're kind of early in your work day, and I'm late in mine. Where can people follow you, and what else have you got going on at the moment?
So I guess certainly follow us at SportsMap, which is on Instagram, Twitter, website sportsmap.com.au. I'm not huge personally on social media, which is other than resharing that stuff, but I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn is probably the main ones you find me. So certainly happy for people to reach out or connect across those mediums and platforms. For us moving forward, or for me, we've got maybe 8 games left of the season and hopefully into some finals for where we're at the moment. So working through some stuff there at the footy club, and that'll carry on through. SportsMap-wise, we've got some courses at the end of the year with Tim McGrath and Jonas Jodo, as well as a conference coming next year in Melbourne. And we'll continue to sort of keep sort of pumping out some good content across our platform. We've got Sue Mays from Australian Ballet and Stu Weimer doing some stuff on syndesmosis, and Edna King's one coming out soon. So, mate, just keep sort of working in that space. But, nothing too. We've been actually heading over to your neck of the woods. You're in the US these days, but we're heading to the UK in October to do some filming with some awesome clinicians there. So in October, so looking forward to that. Mate, more than happy for people to reach out, and it's been fantastic to jump on and have a chat, and good to connect with you the last couple of weeks. And look forward to sort of keeping things moving along and just keep sharing some ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, likewise. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, mate. And thank you for your time.
No worries, mate. Appreciate it. You're a star. Thank you.